We got rejected over 200 times, and this is what we learned. I've always been a little impulsive. I get an idea and just go with it. But that's the thing about life and business. You're always growing, learning, and figuring it out as you go. Welcome to Just Grow With It, the podcast where I share lessons I've learned as a founder and creator, the mistakes, the pivots, and the wins, and how staying consistent can change everything. So if you're ready to grow with me, let's get into it. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Just Grow With It podcast. That is Just Grow With It. I am so embarrassed to say that I was calling it Let's Grow With It for the first few episodes, even though it's my podcast. I named the podcast. I know what the name is, but I had pre-recorded a bunch of episodes, and this is actually the first episode I've recorded after the podcast has gone live. And I guess I must not have remembered. I don't know, it was the early days, but all's to say that is why you should just launch early, even if you make mistakes. Like, I do think that it was much better for me to have just launched and put it out there than for me to constantly make sure things were perfect. Like, would I have rather said the name of the podcast right? Yes, but did I? No, and that's okay. So thank you for the patience, and also thank you for anyone who has been watching, whether you're watching on Spotify or YouTube, whether you're listening on Apple Podcasts. It means so much, and I know this is definitely a more like niche podcast, which is the point of it. I really want my content to be tailored more for people that want to be entrepreneurs, people that are business owners, anyone that is looking for content of someone currently building. You've come to the right place, because that is exactly what this podcast is for. And I'm just really excited to continue to provide value in this content, but then also I really want to bring guests on. So I have about 15, maybe it's like 10 to 15 episodes that I want to record before I start having guests on the podcast. Eventually I would like guests, and if you guys care if they're virtual, let me know, because it's obviously so much easier to get people virtually. I do prefer in person, but it is easier to get people virtually. So let me know if you would rather me open the pool up to virtual podcasts. And I still think I would want to set it up like this. So I would still be recording myself, but I would just obviously have the other person on Zoom or something like that. And yeah, let me know what you guys prefer, because I do want to start bringing guests on, and let me know which guests you want. I have been sharing my newsletter every single week. There have been some delays with the newsletter, depending on the week, but like I said, it's better to put something out there than for it to be perfect, in my opinion. So I'm really happy that I'm at least like putting it out. And if you guys are interested in subscribing to that newsletter, I always share like my week at a glance so that you guys can kind of hear what I'm up to in my business and everything like that. But then I also want to share like resources and things that I've learned, and or any like news that I think is worth knowing and that I find interesting. I will have that linked down below. It's called the Growth List if you want to subscribe to that. And I do plan on making that a bit more interactive and like useful as well. So you guys are listening in the very early stages, and I'm so appreciative of it. But anyways, without further ado, I do want to get to this episode, because this episode is probably one of my most requested, although I do have an episode about this on my YouTube channel. So if you guys are interested in like me answering a Q&A about fundraising, I do have a video on that. And that was filmed shortly after we fundraised. I'm now recording this 3 years after we fundraised, so it has been quite some time since we've raised money, but I still think that I have good insight, especially now being a startup that, it's 3 years down the line after fundraising, what that's looked like. So for context, our startup Rella raised $1 million in our pre-seed funding, and this was before we had revenue, but we did have a product in the market. So it was pre-revenue. We were pre-revenue for way too long. If you guys saw my last video all about pricing, you might have, you saw the journey that we went through with revenue, but we did not have any revenue coming in at all, and we were still able to raise $1 million, and we raised from traditional VCs. This episode is going to be how we ended up raising our pre-seed. And something I always mention when it comes to raising is that we spoke to over 200 investors. I have a ClickUp CRM that we were using with every investor that I had a meeting with, and that list is over 200 people. And that was before we got our first check. So we had spoken to over 200 people before any investor said yes to it. And if you're watching this, I am assuming that you are either actively fundraising or you're thinking of starting a business and thinking about fundraising. So this video is not going to go through whether you should or shouldn't fundraise. I can talk about that if you want, so please let me know if you want me to go through, kind of the pros and cons of fundraising, I'm thinking of interviewing a founder that was bootstrapped and then also maybe a founder that has raised multiple rounds of funding so that you can see the difference of the two, but only you can determine if you should or shouldn't fundraise. I will say though that fundraising does not equal success. I think today we care a lot about vanity metrics, and if you look at all of these lists and publications, the people that have the most recognition are people that have raised a lot of money. So-and-so raised 10 million, whatever it is, and you look at that as like, oh my God, that is a successful company because they raised this much money, now they're valued at this much. But that does not guarantee success. It does not equal success. Obviously, if you raised money and then you have like traction to prove it, that's great. But I do not equate raising to success. I always knew that. Like I always heard that. I always understood that. But I will say when we raised $1 million, I felt successful. And I do think it gave us a false sense of success because we were like, well, all of these investors, 5 investors, which we love very dearly, invested in us. And we ended up raising this like big chunk of money. $1 million is not a small amount of money. So we must be doing something right. And while yes, like that's great that you got investors to believe in you, that does not mean you have like a successful business. It doesn't mean your business is going to be successful, but it is hard as a founder to understand that when you do go through that accomplishment of raising. So while it is an accomplishment, and congratulations if you did raise, do not think that the work stops there. The work is actually just beginning, and now you have to prove that you are a successful company. I'm going to share how our company, Rella, which consisted of 4 pretty inexperienced 22, 23, 24-year-olds, were able to raise $1 million from venture capitalists. So let's go back to the beginning. Why did we decide to raise? Our company consisted of an app that needed to be developed, and we needed to hire talent to do it. It was me and my co-founders, and although my co-founders were developers and they were able to develop the starting point of the app, we felt like we needed to attract talent to help us really bring it to life and to scale. Also, me and my co-founders were not getting paid, but that also took away from my co-founders working full-time on the product or me working full-time on the product because we needed an income. I thankfully had and still have my social media income, which allows me to support myself. But my co-founders, on the other hand, definitely still had to work because they did not have like a side income like I did. And so they still had to work for other companies, and they were doing like part-time work, freelance work, contracting work, but they could not do Rella full-time until we did end up raising money. We also thought, we want to spend money on marketing. We want to hire talented designers. And we were just thinking a lot bigger in the very beginning of how do we bring this to life. And with a software company, the path typically is raising, not as much anymore, but like in 2022, that was definitely the path that we were told to take. And so we decided it just made sense for our company to raise money. And we also, again, had this big vision that we could make this a huge company. And so in order to do that in a smaller amount of time, we needed to raise. Or we thought we needed to raise. Personally, do I regret fundraising? No, I do not regret fundraising at all. However, if I were to start another tech company today, would I fundraise? Again, it depends. It depends on the company that I'm building, and I don't think every tech company needs to raise. So I don't think it was like an absolute necessary thing that we had to do. But do I regret it? No. I think we have the best investors. Like I hear nightmare investor stories and I could not relate less because our investors are incredible. So I don't regret raising at all, but I don't think that we necessarily needed to, but I think it's part of our story and it's one of the reasons why we are where we are today. I always think back to MailChimp, which I know it's one story, but it's one story out of thousands of stories. They are a bootstrapped company, and I'm sure everyone has heard of MailChimp. They were like the email marketing campaign tool. They recently sold for $12 billion, and they did not fundraise, which means the founders and probably employees owned 100% of the company, and they sold for $12 billion. So MailChimp never raised, so you don't have to. I also think if you are going to be raising VC, so venture capital, you should raise at a minimum $750,000 because VCs are not going to put super small checks because their thought process is I'm giving you actually a lump sum of money so that you can build something and scale quickly. And I don't want your job to be fundraising. So if I'm going to give you $200,000 and let's say you're only planning on raising $300,000 or $400,000 in 6 months or less, you're going to have to go and fundraise another round. And that's going to take time away from the business. I'd rather give you $1 million and then you can go and scale and do something with that. And you don't have to worry about fundraising for 2 years or whatever that might look like. So with VC, there is such thing as like raising too little money, and they're not going to invest in you if you're raising too little. So if you are going the traditional venture capital route, I always say try to raise at least 750,000 or more. But if you don't, I'm sure that investors will tell you that, and you'll figure it out at some point during the fundraising process. I was recently on a call with some founders, and they asked if they could pitch their presentation or their pitch deck to me and if I could give them advice on it. So we acted as if I was an investor and, they were presenting their company to me. And the number one piece of advice that I had to give them, and the number one feedback that I had for them, is they need to lean into storytelling a lot more than they currently were. Fundraising is all about storytelling. If you don't have a story, you just will not be able to raise. And the number one way to make sure that you have a story when you're presenting, or that your pitch deck reflects a story, is to write out your story first. So before you open Canva, before you open PowerPoint, write out your story first and then connect slides to your story. So I think most founders, which this is what we did at first, do the opposite, where they try to make a pitch deck first. So they'll go into ChatGPT and be like, help me come up with an outline for my pitch deck. Or they'll go to Canva and they'll look up pitch deck in the templates, and they'll pick a template, they'll find an outline, and then they'll start filling in the dots and start creating this pitch deck based off of, the things that everyone says need to be in a pitch deck. So the problem, the solution, the market size, founding team, projections, business model, etc. The reason why I think that's not going to work is because when you are pitching in front of investors, you are telling them a story. So if you're jumping around from point to point in your slides and it's not a cohesive story, it's not going to compel investors. They're not going to get excited about it, and it's just not going to make a lot of sense. And the things that every good story has, especially when it comes to fundraising, is what is the problem? What is the solution? Why are you the team to build it? And why is now the right time? Those 4 components can craft a really compelling story. I would pick up your phone, I would pretend like you're on FaceTime or do a voice memo and speak your story out loud. Because when you are pitching in front of investors, you will be saying the story out loud. So write it, say it out loud, polish it up, and then transfer that to some slides. For example, when we raised money for Rella, I started the story out by talking about my experience. Most pitch decks do not start with the founder itself. Most pitch decks go into problem solution, business model, market size, founding team, and that might work for some stories. But for ours, the story starts with me. I've been a creator for over a decade. I then started a social media agency after I was able to do content creation full-time and leave my corporate job. Once I started my agency and was doing content full-time, I noticed all of the tools that I was using were so inefficient. I was wasting time on so many logistics, on so many different admin tools, and I wasn't spending as much time on the creative work that I was being paid to do. I knew that there needed to be a better solution, but when I looked, there really wasn't any. All of the tools that are out there are outdated, or they're not made for social media. And so that is where Rella comes in. And I said that creators, because at the time we were targeting creators, even though that's not really who Rella targets anymore. I just mentioned that the pain point was that creators were spending too much time on these admin tasks, and they were wasting a lot of money on subscriptions and also wasted time, and there needed to be a better solution. And then after I told my story, I would jump into why is this the right time? It's not just my problem. This is happening to millions of creators around the world. This is how many people work in the industry. This is how big the industry is. These are all the problems that we face. And then this is why Rella is the solution. And then I would go into what Rella is. And from Rella, I would talk about the solution, I would talk about the product, I would talk about the business model, I would talk about our competitors and where we fit on that competitive analysis. And then at the very end, I would mention the rest of the team. Every story is going to be different, so there's not one flow that works. It just has to address those 4 questions. What is the problem? What is the solution? Why are you the team to build it? Not who is the team. Why are you the team to build it? And why is now a good time? So not how big is the market, but why is now, 2025, if you're watching this in 2026, why is this year the time to build this tool? And that is how you can tell your story. Another mistake that I've seen founders make, and the advice I also gave to these founders in this meeting, is that when you are storytelling, it can get really confusing when you have multiple voices. So pick one storyteller. As the CEO of Rella, and as the person who was the, focal point of the story, where it was coming from my experience and my personal pain points, I was the storyteller. I was the only person on the team that was reaching out to investors, that was in meetings with investors, that was pitching our company, that was in front of people for pitch competitions. So I was the main person raising. If you have multiple co-founders, do not have all of the co-founders on the very first call. There should only be one person on the call, one person doing the reach out, one person really spearheading the raise, because when you have too many people, it can get confusing. It's not as cohesive of a story because you're kind of like bouncing around, and beware of contradicting each other. Investors are going to be asking you tons of questions in these calls, and if one person has one answer and then the other person has another answer, even if, maybe it's just something you guys haven't discussed, or maybe someone worded it in a weird way, or you wouldn't have said it that way, it's going to make your team look really weak if you don't have consistency. And it's harder to have consistency when there's multiple people in the call versus if it's just you tackling all of those questions. Once we met with investors multiple times, I would invite my co-founders if the investors wanted to meet them, which most of the time they did. And that's when they would come in and they would answer more of the technical questions and everything like that. And our investors wanted to make sure that, we had a good team. But when it came to those initial meetings, it was just me, and that was on purpose. And if you do have co-founders, while you are fundraising, your other co-founders should be working on your business. If I was an investor and I saw all the co-founders on a pitch meeting, I would question who is running the business, because as an investor, I know that fundraising is a full-time job. So why is everyone here, and who is actually running the company? Now that you have your story, and I'm not going to call it a pitch, I'm going to call it a story, you need to find your investors. So find investors to actually tell this story to. People say that fundraising is a full-time job, and they're not totally wrong, because it does take up most of your time. Sometimes I'll go to my Google Calendar from 2022 when we were fundraising and see every single time slot filled with meetings on my calendar. And now, as someone who really doesn't take a lot of meetings, it is like, I can't believe I did that. I'm like, who was she? My calendar was so full when we were fundraising, because it is a full-time job. Keep in mind, we are still not at the point where you are actively fundraising. This is all the prep work that goes into fundraising. So this is why people say it's a full-time job. But as you're doing your prep work, you're going to want to find some investors that meet your criteria. The criteria that you need to look for is industry and the stage that they invest in. If you are a pre-seed company, meaning pre-seed is typically first round of investing. So maybe this is after friends and family. If you did raise friends and family, this is usually very beginning of a product launch, or pre-revenue, or very early stages of revenue. It's kind of like you guys are just starting your company. That would be a pre-seed stage. Do not reach out to investors that are Series A, which means you need to have at least $1 million in ARR. Like those funds are not going to invest in your pre-seed stage company. Or if you are a fintech company, do not bother reaching out to funds, no matter the stage, if they invest in ed tech or health tech and they don't mention anything about fintech on their website, because then you're just going to be wasting your time. And unfortunately, there is a lot of time that can be wasted when you're in the fundraising process, because a lot of people might not be a good fit. They might know that they would never invest, and you're still wasting your time taking a meeting with them. I do, though, always view it as like each investor is practice. So you really learn to perfect your story. However, there's still a lot of time that can be wasted. And here are some tactical ways of how you're actually going to find these investors. Number one, I used Crunchbase every single day. I paid for the pro subscription. Crunchbase is a great tool because you can look up companies and see who invested in them, or you can look up funds and see which companies they've invested in and when they deployed those checks. This is really important because I would look not at competitors, because you obviously don't want an investor that has a competitor to you to hear about your company, because then they can just tell their portfolio company, which is a competitor of yours, what you're doing. So don't go after competitors' investors, but what you should go after is companies that are similar to you, whether it's the similar industry or similar size or similar stage, similar vertical as you, and look at their investors. And those are the people you need to reach out to. Or in the early days, we would always compare ourselves to kind of like a honey book for creators, which again, this is before our pivot is when we fundraised, but that's how we would compare ourselves. And so I looked at Honeybook's early stage investors, because clearly, Honeybook is now a multi-billion-dollar company, and so they did well for them. So maybe if someone sees a similar company or have a company with a similar trajectory to Honeybook, they would want to invest in us. So I would always put myself in the mind of an investor and say, why would I invest in this company? It's because, I've seen it do well in the past. I have a similar company in a different industry that I've invested in, etc. So use Crunchbase to find those investors. Another great resource was LinkedIn and Twitter, or X. X is huge in the tech field. I started my X account or Twitter account solely because I was fundraising. So I started from scratch, and I would like tweet every now and then random things about Rella, just so that I didn't look like a bot that like had 0 tweets, and I would like interact with people on Twitter and stuff. But I got it because investors are on Twitter and they're always talking about when they're deploying checks, who they're raising from, what they're looking for, which companies they've invested in. And I wanted to be part of that conversation. We actually got an investment offer from someone that I cold DM'd on Twitter. So I found her Twitter, I cold DM'd her, we set up a call, we had a series of calls, and they offered to invest $125,000 into our company. We ended up turning them down because this was at the end of our fundraise and we just had better, more fair offers from other investors, so we didn't end up taking their money. But that's pretty cool that we got an investment opportunity from a company through a cold DM on Twitter. And LinkedIn is obviously a place where a lot of professionals use it, but I would follow a bunch of investors, a bunch of funds, a bunch of other startups, and see who they're talking to and go on LinkedIn, because there's always people chatting similarly to X, but a little bit more polished and professional on LinkedIn to see about who they're investing in. But I would actually use LinkedIn a lot to share a lot about like my founder personal story. So I still use LinkedIn for that reason. I'm trying to build my personal brand on there because I wanted to position myself as an expert in the field that we were raising in, so that when I did reach out to an investor, they would see that, they would want to take a meeting with me. And so I did find a couple people from LinkedIn, but honestly, Twitter was the main thing that I was using when we were fundraising. And another way that I found investors was through other founders. So the same way that I used Twitter and LinkedIn for funds, I would also use it to connect with other founders. I would reach out to them, I would ask them for advice or ask them if I could set up a call, and we could pick each other's brains, what the fundraising process or what they were building or anything like that. It didn't even matter the company. If I was like curious about you, I would want to reach out and get to know you. And I find that a lot of founders are super friendly, and they would just hop on a call and we would just talk about being founders and network that way. And then I would ask if I could have an intro to their investors, and that's actually how we met our first investor, who wrote us our first check, and that investor opened the door to help us close our entire round. So I would definitely recommend reaching out to other founders, because having a warm intro like that is so much better than a cold email or a cold DM from like someone that you find on Crunchbase or LinkedIn or Twitter. You have to categorize all these investors in a CRM. We used ClickUp, like I mentioned earlier, so have some system. I don't necessarily recommend ClickUp. I think it's kind of the same as every other CRM that might be out there, but get a CRM to track. We would track their name, the fund, the stage, when we last reach out to them, and then like any notes. And that was super helpful because it always reminded me to follow up with investors that maybe hadn't reached back out to us or never answered me. And I would use that CRM to keep track of all of that. When you're reaching out to these funds, people have asked me, do I reach out to a partner? Do I reach out to an associate? And although you probably will get a higher response rate from associates, I always found that the best person to go to, and this was actually advice that I had gotten as well, is to just go to the partner. And this is kind of like the, why don't you just call Taylor up meme? But it's true. If you can, always try to go directly to the partner, because associates are not the decision makers. They are the first entry point, and it is just better to skip that step and go directly to the person that's going to be making the decision. And it's not like they never answer. It's not like they never have answer any cold emails or DMs. I had a very high success rate from reaching out to these partners of the funds. Try to avoid going to an associate and going straight to the partner. For example, one of our investors, which is Precursor, we had spoken with them very early on in our fundraising journey, and I had spoken with an associate at Precursor. They ended up passing on us, and then a few months later, after we got our first check in, our first check investor introduced me to the partner, which is Charles at Precursor. I had a direct intro to Charles. We had a meeting, and he decided to invest. So even though I had spoken with his fund earlier in my fundraising process, he decided to invest after I spoke with him directly. I will also say, in the very early days of our fundraising process, the pitch was probably bad. We didn't have any, other investors investing in us. So obviously having a first check-in helped. We didn't have as much traction. There could be a number of reasons of why we were passed on in the beginning and we weren't, towards the end of the fundraise. But it just goes to show that that associate doesn't have the power that the partner has. And so it's just easier to go to the partner. I will say you have to be as creative as possible. I didn't solely rely on websites and that's it. I went to networking events. I asked any person I had a meeting with, if it was an investor, if it was a founder, it didn't matter who. I asked them, is there anyone that you think that I should meet? I would go through people that I know's LinkedIn followings and ask them, hey, do you know this person well enough to give me an intro because I really want to talk to them? Was so creative with the ways that I reached out to investors. I would DM them on Instagram. I would find their like private Instagram accounts and DM them on Instagram because I figured that no one's probably DMing them on Instagram, so I might as well. And I got so many responses from that. So be creative with how you reach out to people and don't just do the, traditional generic ways that you think you need to follow or the rules that you need to follow. You have to be as creative as possible. You're probably going to talk to so many people before you get a yes. So now that you have your story, you have kind of a rough list of investors that you want to talk to, you have to get your materials in order. As you're reaching out to these investors, what you're going to need to have is a good email blurb, 3 bullet points on like really impressive stats, whether it's signing on a big client, whatever it is, you should have 3 bullet points of some impressive stats. We're raising this amount of money, or we're raising a pre-seed round, would love to chat. Here's my calendar link. Always have a calendar link. It makes it so easy for investors to just pick a time on your calendar versus going back and forth on what time works. I personally use Calendly for it and I really like it, so that's my suggestion, but there's so many out there that you can choose from. And although you have a blurb that you're sending out to everyone, the intro is always going to be different no matter who you're reaching out to. So if you're reaching out to a fund that has invested in vertical SaaS and you are a vertical SaaS company in X industry, what you're going to do is you're going to reach out to this investor and say, hi, my name is Natalie. I see that you invest in XYZ. This is a perfect fit because this is what we're building. Go into your blurb. But that first sentence is custom to that investor, because if you're just copying pasting the same exact thing to everyone with no customization, no personalization in the beginning, they're going to know it's going to feel inauthentic. It's going to feel spammy. They want to know that you did at least a little bit of research into who they are, so you're not just wasting their time. Now that you have your email blurb, you need to come up with a forwardable blurb. This is not a blurb that you're emailing to investors. This is actually a blurb that you're going to be emailing to anyone that wants to intro you to someone. So hear me out. If you meet a founder and you say, hey, I would love for you to intro me to one of your investors, is that fine? Chances are they're going to say, sure, send me an email. This email is going to say, hi, founder. Thanks so much for chatting the other day. I loved hearing about fund, whatever fund you're looking to get an intro to. I think they would be a great fit because XYZ, personalization, your blurb, the same blurb from before, you can copy and paste it. I'd love an intro. Let me know if that is possible. Send. What the founder is going to do is they're going to just hit the forward button, forward it to their investor and say, do you want an intro? Do not make the person that you are asking to intro you to someone to do work and have to come up with a blurb about your company, has to come up with paragraphs about, like, hey, can I introduce you to this person? This is what they do, blah, 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 blah. That's too much work. No one wants to do that. When you make it as easy as possible for someone to intro you and all they have to do is hit a forward button, it is a no-brainer. They're going to send you that intro. So that is how you send a forwardable blurb. And have a pitch deck and your demo ready because you're going to be linking that pitch deck to the blurb. I made our pitch deck in Canva, but you can make it in anything, but I truly just recommend Canva. It makes it so easy. And we got so many compliments from investors on our pitch deck. So definitely use Canva. And then I would actually send my pitch deck through a link called DocSend. Highly, highly recommend DocSend if you are a founder. You're able to have like an email gate, which is very common. Founders and investors are used to using DocSend. So the investor will enter their email. So then you'll get a notification about when an investor viewed your pitch deck and you can see how much time they spent on each slide. So if they're spending a lot of time on the problem slide or the team slide, it can start answering some questions on like what things were confusing or what did they really care about, what were they looking at, or if they only clicked on the first 3 slides and decided to exit out of it, you'll be able to see that as well. So it's really great for seeing and collecting emails on who actually even viewed your pitch deck, because then you can even see like who opened your email, who took the time to care, and you can always email them and follow up with them. But you can always upload new versions of the deck to DocSend. So although it's the same link, you can upload new versions all the time. So like if you send a link to someone and then then the next day you update your pitch deck. You don't want to send them a new link. You can just send them that DocSend link. And DocSend is pretty common when it comes to the startup world. So no one's going to be thrown off by having to enter their email to view your pitch deck. And then you're going to have a data room where you're going to store all of your important materials. This is any resource that investors are looking for. We just had a Google Drive. It said data room. It had our articles of organization, our financial model. I don't even remember everything that it had, but as investors start asking you questions about, hey, do you have this, and this, you can send them your data room, which is going to have all of those important documents in one place. And if you are raising your first round, a lot of people ask us if we did a priced round. We did not. We raised on a YC safe. It is the easiest way to raise your first round on. And if you are raising your very first round of institutional capital, most investors are expecting it to be on a safe. It just makes it easy for both parties. You don't have to get lawyers involved. You don't need to have, someone come and set a valuation for your company. And it's just a lot easier to get the check wired to you. So I would recommend a YC safe if you are just starting out. Now that you have all your prep work done, you have your story, you have your preliminary list of investors, you have your data room and all of your materials set up. Now it's time to start actually reaching out to investors. Getting a warm intro is definitely easier than cold outreach, but that's not to say that cold outreach doesn't work. I feel like people on the internet kind of try to say, like, if you don't have a warm intro, then good luck. I found a lot of people through cold intros and cold emails. So I actually think that cold emails work, and you can always cold email someone. And if it works, then you can ask them to intro you to someone else. And so then it is kind of like a warm intro because someone else is doing the introduction. But I would cold email so many people. I have 2,000 plus people. Like if we talked to 200 people, we probably emailed 2,000 people. Like who knows how many it was. So I would cold email as many people as you can that fit the criteria that you're looking into. Cold DM them, get creative, like I said, and then try to find other founders because founders are more likely to answer you and get them to intro you to their investors. So those are like the biggest tips on reaching out to investors. Get creative with how you find their email, get creative on which channel you reach out to them. Don't be afraid to follow up. As I would say up to like 4 times. Like I think my number was 3 to 4 times I would follow up with them before I gave up because also I didn't want to keep wasting my time. But I would follow up with people multiple times. I would actually say people ended up scheduling a call with me more times on the follow-up than the original cold email. Following up is not annoying, and it's also not personal if they don't answer your first email. These people are very busy. They get so many emails. If you are persistent and you are respectful and you are not spammy and you are not annoying, a lot of investors will respond to you. And I take that trait with me about the art of the follow-up. Even today, I am always following up with people because I also know that there are a lot of emails that I'll get that I just like forget to answer, and it's nothing personal. And I'm so thankful when people follow up with me. So make sure that you're always following up at least like 3 or 4 times. And I feel like this is an obvious one, but we just went through a round of interviews for Rella, and not a lot of people did this, but I think it's similar when you're raising money as well as when you have like a job interview or something. Whenever you have something formal like that, send a thank you follow-up. After every investor call that I had, I would send them a thank you. I would recap a little bit about the company, send them any materials that they asked for on the call, ask them if they want to schedule another call with the rest of the team. I would always send them a follow-up. There's so many people I feel like that don't send a follow-up after a call. They just like expect that person to follow up with them later, and that's not a good system. So make sure that after every single call that you have with an investor, with a founder, no matter who it is, send a follow-up thanking them for their time. A little goes a long way, guys, and that is one of those things that takes 5 seconds to do, but is very impressionable. One thing that I do want to talk about is mindset. So this is not going to be some like woo-woo, you have to like manifest and anything like that, because I truly don't believe in like, oh, if you just like think about things, they're gonna happen. Like, no, you have to put in a lot of work into them to make them happen. But I think your mindset is incredibly important. And what I mean by that is the mindset that I had going into it was that I'm gonna get rejected a lot. Like I've already set the expectation. And it's not if I raise money. We're not going into this process with the thought process of, well, if we raise $1 million, if we raise our pre-seed round of funding. No, we're going into it with the thought process of when we raise our first round of funding. We know it's going to happen. And the reason why that mindset helped me so much is because it allowed me to not give up after the first 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, 150, 200 rejections that we had because I didn't have a timeline. I didn't say, okay, well, like if we don't raise by this time, then we're just not going to raise. Like, guys, 7 months to get our first check. That is not common. And that's not something that like, if you are talking to people that like are making like tech bro content on the internet and you're like, oh, this person's been trying to raise their pre-seed round of funding for 6 months, everyone would tell you, oh, they're not going to do it. They're not going to do it. But I'm here to say that we did. And I'm very proud of that because I had that mindset. I was like, I'm not giving up. Like, I am not giving up. We're raising this money one way or another. And that allowed me to carry on through all of those rejections. And I instilled that motto in my team. I always talked to them about that. They probably got annoyed with me, but I always said, it's not if, it's when. And you just have to go into that mindset. The rejection is not personal. The rejection will happen. You have to believe in your business more than anyone else because you will hear constantly, I don't think this business is like scalable. I don't think that this business has enough. I don't think that you guys are better than your competition. I don't think that this is a big enough problem. Like, no matter what it is, you're going to hear so much pushback and it's not personal, but you cannot let it get to you in terms of giving up. Of course, you can like take feedback with grains of salt and, make adjustments and everything like that. But in terms of letting it stop you from fundraising or giving up your company or, losing your confidence, you can't have it do that because if you don't go into a mindset that you will get rejected a million times, you probably will let it shake your confidence and you just can't let that happen. It's one of the hardest things to get used to rejection and get used to the word no, but still have the utmost confidence in what you're building. And then the last step of fundraising is getting that first check. An investor said yes, it's time to celebrate. Even though, go back to what I said in the beginning, it does not equal success. It is still an accomplishment. So even though it's not like, mama, I made it, it's still like, oh my God, we got through this. This is such an accomplishment. Now we can finally start working on the business. Usually VCs should be able to make a decision within 2 to 3 weeks. That's what I found. If an investor is stringing you along for months, they're probably just wasting your time. We had an investor that we talked to for like 3 months. They never ended up writing a check, but they constantly kept pulling us in meetings and asking us questions. And all the time I was like, oh, well, talk to them a little bit more. If we just continue to talk to them and like show them our progress and all that, then they'll invest. And they just never ended up investing. I think they knew deep down that like they were never going to invest, but they like maybe hoped that we would come around and miraculously like sprout to the top and they could invest or something. I don't know what they were hoping for, but at the end of the day, all of the investors that wrote a check into Rella decided within 2 to 3 weeks. And so that is why I don't think that if an investor is talking to you for months, they probably are never going to write a check. And once you get that first check, your investor is now invested in the company, but they also obviously are invested in the success of the company. So they want you to close this round. They want you to do well. They most likely will already do this, but if they don't take the initiative, you should take the initiative to make sure that they introduce you to anyone in their network that could potentially invest, anyone they've ever co-invested in the past, and they can send those intros. You can send them the blurb. They can give you feedback and revisions on it, but they can at least help set up those intros for you and get the ball moving. Because after we got our first check, it took us like 1 month to raise the rest of the round. The first check is really that gateway check that you need to close the rest of your round because investors have FOMO. And if they see one investor investing, they're going to want to invest. So that is why it's usually a lot easier when you have one investor that invests and then the rest can follow. And like I said, it took us about 7 months to get our first check. So don't get discouraged, guys. And of course, if you're raising money, fundraising from VCs is not the only way to raise money. There's accelerators, there's grants, there's angel investors, there's incubators. Rella did a equity-free accelerator, and we also won a pitch competition and received an equity-free grant. So those options are out there. You just have to do a lot of research and try to find them, but they are out there. A lot of the times I found them on like LinkedIn or X or anything like that. So there are other things that you can do besides just going after traditional VCs, but this video I did want to cover how to raise money from traditional VCs because I know that that's a question that I get a lot. I also wanted to say that I do calls with other founders. I'll have the link to my Stand store if you guys do want to book one of those calls. And these are like 1 hour long, super in-depth calls where it can really be whatever you want. It doesn't have to be going over your pitch deck or anything like that, but I tried to be the best resource I can be for you in terms of like pitch deck revisions. If you have any like product market fit questions, marketing questions, anything at all related to starting a business, I'll have my link down below so you guys can check. This was by far the longest longest podcast episode of Just Grow With It so far because there's just so much to cover. So I hope that you guys stay tuned or stayed with me until the end. Thank you if you did. And if you guys are raising money, I wish you the best of luck. It is a process. I do not miss it at all. We didn't have to raise any other rounds of funding, thank God, because I don't miss it. Let me know any of your thoughts or anything that you're like thinking about in the process in the comments below. And I will see you guys next week with another episode of Just Grow With It. Bye, guys.